Hello. Today we're going to talk about the human brain. We know that the brain is protected by the skull. As you can clearly see here, the skull is hard, and tissues that are forming the brain are made up of brain cells, which are basically soft tissues. So that's why we need protection for the brain. The way we think, that we do when we do things, it's of course coming from the brain. The thing that controls our mind. Everything we move, we use our muscles, is controlled by the human brain. So let's now review the structures that make up the human brain. Do you know that the human brain is made up of billions of cells? Now, these cells are called neurons. Okay? Neurons are important because they basically are the ones responsible for the transmission of the nerve or electrical impulses. So as you can clearly see here, a neuron, which makes up the billions of cells that are found within the brain, it has parts. The first one is called the dendrite. And then we have the cell body, followed by the axon. Okay? The one that will be able to receive the nerve or neural impulse is the dendrite. Then it goes to the cell body, which contains the nucleus and the cytoplasm in them. Then the electrical impulse will travel from the cell body to the axon. So if you'll observe, the first letter of axon is A, and therefore the transmission of the nerve impulse will be A for away from the cell body. Okay? So these neurons are what we call the nerve cells. Now there is another type of cell that you find in your brain. We call that neuroglial cells or glial cells. Neuroglial cells are the supporting cells. They are not responsible for the transmission of nerve impulses, but they are responsible for protecting and supporting the neurons or the nerve cells. Now, neuroglial cells can be classified through different types. First one is called the astrocyte. Now this particular cell called the astrocyte is responsible for the formation of your blood-brain barrier. So this is therefore important in trying to protect the brain, especially in the terms of substance that may harm the brain. That's why this blood-brain barrier is very important. The other one is called the oligodendrocyte. And this type of neuroglial cell is the one responsible for the formation of what we call the myelin. Now the oligodendrocyte, as we said, is important for myelin formation, which is important in speeding up the conduction of the nerve impulses within the axons. The presence of myelin on the axons will allow the conduction of the nerve impulse, whereby the nerve impulse will jump from one node of Ranvier to the next node of Ranvier. So that is what we mean by the word saltatory nerve conduction. It's going to be faster because instead of slowly moving through the axon, the nerve impulse will be jumping from one node of Ranvier to the next node of Ranvier. Now, so bear in mind that these are important cells. The other one is called the ependymal cells. The ependymal cells are important neuroglial cells because they are responsible for the formation of your cerebrospinal fluid. So So cerebrospinal fluid is important because it also helps protect the human brain. The fourth type is called the microglial cells. So from the word micro means small. It's the smallest of the glial cells that we have. So they are important in the protection of the brain too. Okay, so it's just the smallest type of glial cell. Okay, now, so we have two types of cells in the brain. One would be the neurons, or the actual nerve cells or neurons. Then you have your neuroglial cells. Now, the other part that we need to discuss today would be about the protection of the brain. Aside from the skull, there is what we call the meninges. The meninges, just get this, have three layers. The first layer that is found on the surface of the brain is called the pia mater, something like this. The pia mater is on the surface of the brain, followed by the second layer of the meninges called the what? So let this represent the arachnoid layer. And finally, the outermost layer of the brain, that is of the meninges that protects the brain, is called the dura mater, or dura. Okay? So above that would be, of course, what? The skull, particularly the cranium. Something like this. So if you notice here, so the cranium is the one that is above the dura mater. Now what do you call the space between the dura and the bony cranium? It's called what? The epidural space. Now what do you call the space below the dura? It's subdural space. What does sub mean? Below. Now what do you call the space below the arachnoid? It's called the subarachnoid space. So bear in mind the subarachnoid space therefore is important because that is where you find the cerebrospinal fluid. Again, the cerebrospinal fluid also helps protect the brain. It's found in where? The subarachnoid space. Okay? Now, with regards to the lobes of the brain, we need to know them. The lobes of the brain are the following. In terms of the one in front, and it's amazingly simple because it's called the frontal lobe. So what they call the lobe of the brain that is found in front, it's called the frontal lobe. What about the part of the brain that is considered the one on top? It's called the parietal lobe of the brain. What about the area at the back of the brain? It's called the occipital lobe. Occipital lobe is found posteriorly or at the back of the brain. And the one that is found in the area of the temple is called the temporal lobe of the brain. So let's review. Frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe. Now there is a structure here. This is called the cerebellum. Okay? Now why is the cerebellum important? It's important for maintaining balance or coordination. So if I step on one foot, I can maintain my balance because I'm able to have an intact cerebellum. Okay? So it's not only for balance but including coordination. When we do a finger to nose test, it's essentially designed for testing for coordination. Now, the frontal lobe is important because this is where you have the primary motor cortex, or what we call the primary motor area. On the other hand, the parietal lobe is important because it is where you find the primary sensory cortex or sensory area. So when somebody pinches you, you would expect the pain will be what? Brought into the parietal lobe. Now what about the temporal lobe? The temporal lobe, on the other hand, is where you find your auditory cortex, which makes sense because it's in the area of the ear. Now what about the occipital lobe? The occipital lobe is where you find the visual cortex, which means that this particular part of the brain is where sense of sight is being processed. So what lobe is that? It's called the occipital lobe of the brain. Okay? So those are the basic lobes of the brain. We talked about the meninges. We talked about the importance of the skull protecting the brain. Now, let's talk about the other important aspect of the brain, called the ventricles of the brain. So you see these areas here? These are ventricles of the brain, and they contain cerebrospinal fluid. Now, with regard to the ventricles of the brain, there are many of them found in the brain itself. Okay? So the first one on top would be called the lateral ventricles. Okay? These lateral ventricles, as we know, there are two of them. So the lateral ventricles, therefore, are important because, as we said, they're found in the topmost layer in regards to the other ventricles of the brain. The topmost ventricle will be the lateral ventricle. This will be followed by the third ventricle. Now, what connects the lateral ventricle with the third ventricle? It's called the interventricular foramen of Monro. And then there is another ventricle after the third ventricle. It's called the fourth ventricle. And what connects the third with the fourth ventricle? It's called the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. Aqueduct of Sylvius, S-Y-L-V-I-U-S. And of course, after the fourth ventricle, you have two openings or foramen called the foramen of Meninges and the other one is the foramen of Luschka. So these two openings are responsible for bringing the cerebrospinal fluid eventually around what? The subarachnoid space, which is found around the brain, and of course it goes down all the way around the spinal cord. So take note, therefore, it comes from the foramen of Meninges and Luschka into the subarachnoid space, which means that from the fourth ventricle here, we expect the passage of the cerebrospinal fluid from the fourth ventricle around the brain through the foramen of Meninges and Luschka into the subarachnoid space, which is the space, as we have said, found below the arachnoid. Okay? And then here in the subarachnoid space, the fluid will be drained by the arachnoid villi. So these arachnoid villi obviously are part of the arachnoid. The arachnoid villi will now be the one responsible for draining the fluid into the venous circulation through the venous sinuses and eventually into the veins. So the CSF now goes back to the veins. Now, in the formation of the cerebrospinal fluid, bear in mind that these ventricles are spaces that are occupied by the CSF, but the walls of each of these lateral, third, and fourth ventricles, what do they contain? The choroid plexus. The choroid plexus is essentially made up of together with the ependymal cells. Choroid plexus are made up of capillaries, which are blood vessels. So what does a blood vessel contain? Blood. And what does blood contain? Plasma and cells. The plasma is water. So in other words, the raw material needed to form your cerebrospinal fluid really comes from the blood that is found within the capillaries, called the choroid plexus. Okay? So bear in mind, therefore, choroid plexus, they, together with the ependymal cells, produce the cerebrospinal fluid, and the arachnoid villi are responsible for draining the cerebrospinal fluid that is found within the subarachnoid space, and in turn bring them back into the blood through the veins, through the venous sinuses. Okay? So these are the things we're expected to know. Okay, we will stop there. Have a good day.